As World War II drew to a close, the differences among the Allied powers became more pronounced. Differences that had been put aside in the face of a common enemy during the war now began to surface as the victorious nations, eager for peace, sought to regain their pre-war status and take advantage of victory. While Britain and France maneuvered to maintain a hold on the colonial empires they had possessed before the war, the Soviet Union, which had taken the worst damage in the war, sought territory to buffer it against any future threat of invasion. The Soviet Union also saw itself in a good position to benefit from the rising tide of national liberation in Africa and Asia, especially since many of these movements were led by or strongly influenced by local communist parties. For the United States, it was a whole new world. The U.S., the 17th ranked military power in 1939, found itself by 1945 with the world's biggest navy, biggest air force, and of course, the world's sole nuclear power. But in the aftermath of World War II, all the powers rapidly demobilized their armed forces and prepared for peacetime. The founding of the United Nations in San Francisco suggested the possibility of a world of peace and cooperation.
Charter of the United Nations, which you are now signing, is a solid structure upon which we can build for a better world.
But some thought that because America possessed half of the world's wealth and the world's strongest military, its foreign policy should be directed at maintaining its new role as a dominant world power. They saw their only competitor in the world as the Soviet Union and the world communist movement. However, transforming the United States into a consistently dominant world power would be no easy matter, for the American people were again weary of war and sacrifice.
For the most part, your average pragmatic American politician in 1946 recognized that the Soviet Union was a threat to the West, and that the Cold War was not something that was manufactured by hawks in Washington. It was something that evolved because of policy decisions in both sides, both in Washington and in Moscow. But while that's going on, you have the majority of the United States population just wanting to get on from World War II. You know, your average Joe who'd come back from World War II just wanted to buy a house in the suburbs, you know, go to Levittown, get a job, and raise a family and have a quiet life. He had already led, you know, this traumatic existence, starting with his childhood in the Depression, then going through World War II, coming home from that, you know, life-altering experience and life-defining experience. All he wanted to do was live a quiet life for the most part, your average American veteran.
So for the time being, America concerned itself with getting back to everyday life, welcoming home the victorious soldiers and basking in the special feeling of joy and relief that only peace can bring. But the end of World War II also brought with it many loose ends that would have to be dealt with. As the war ended in the Pacific, there were many places in Asia where Japanese armies were still in occupation. Agreements were made between the Allies on how they were to be disarmed and the territories they occupied administered. So Britain moved troops into the southern part of French Indochina, quickly allowing French troops to replace them, and the Dutch moved back into the Dutch East Indies. In Korea, American troops landed to occupy the southern part of the country as Soviet troops occupied the north.
And the United States had been involved in South Korea because at the end of the Second World War, we had taken the surrender of Japanese forces south of the 30th parallel. The Russians had taken the surrender of Japanese forces north of the 30th parallel. It was just an administrative decision made for convenience. We did not intend for Korea to be divided, but once we had Russian forces in the north, our forces in the south, the political system in both countries then started to evolve, so we had two competing political organizations, a South Korean government and a North Korean government.
When American and Soviet forces occupied Korea in 1945 to disarm the Japanese soldiers there, the intent was to bring about a unified and independent Korea, something which had not existed since 1910 when the Japanese had finally conquered the peninsula. In fact, Japan had been trying to take over Korea since the 1500s, and in 1910 finally achieved that objective, completely crushing and destroying all Korean resistance.
In 1938, the Japanese began drafting Koreans, men for labor and military service, and women into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers. In fact, many future leaders of the South Korean army and government got their start in the Japanese army. Among those resisting the Japanese was Kim Il-sung, a leader of a group of fledgling Korean communists. He was eventually forced to cross the border into China and then into Siberia, where he became a part of the Soviet Red Army, ultimately being sent back into Korea in 1942. So in 1945, with Russia occupying the North and the United States in the South, two separate Korean governments were set up. Kim Il-sung proclaimed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, and in the south, the U.S. appointed Syngman Rhee, the son of a noble Korean family who had been educated at Princeton, as head of government. As Kim cracked down on opposition to him in the north, Rhee did the same in the south. Both proclaimed that their own government was the only legitimate government for all of Korea and began to exchange threats and border provocations. At the same time, Mao Zedong's communists swept to power in the Chinese Civil War, and under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, the communist-led resistance in Vietnam began seriously challenging the French colonial rulers there.
Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
Then you
answer to
denied-
a question
then you-
which invades his, absolutely invades
Then
his
you
right.
denied, you refused to answer that question. Is that correct? Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
In the United States, a campaign of anti-communism, spurred on by the communist takeover in Czechoslovakia and the Berlin blockade, began to mobilize the American people to rearm and take a more aggressive role in world affairs. President Truman was open to intensifying the struggle against the growing communist influence, but was still reluctant to take on the role of a superpower and had no ambitions for getting the United States involved in another war. In fact, when President Rhee's rhetoric about invading the North became too shrill for comfort, Truman refused to supply Rhee's ROK Army with heavy weapons.
Syngman Rhee was basically a tin pot dictator, and if you armed him with modern equipment and modern weapons, he was going to go after North Korea and start a war. So they didn't want to do that. The Americans didn't want to see a war on the Korean Peninsula for fear that it would generate an East-West confrontation. So they made a policy decision to lightly equip the South Korean military. So they did have some American advisors, the KMAG group, for example, and the KMAG group actually kept clamoring for heavier equipment, artillery, tanks, anti-tank weapons, and Air Force. None of those things Washington was prepared to allow because they didn't trust Rhee. They didn't trust him to use those things in a defensive capacity. And in fact, that was probably the right decision, because had they given him those sorts of things, he probably would have gone after Pyongyang.
The United States was indicating in 1950, early 1950, that we wanted to get out of Korea, that maybe it wasn't going to be part of our defense perimeter in Asia. And in fact, Secretary of State Atchison drew a defense perimeter that went through Japan, Okinawa, to the Philippines, left off both Taiwan, which we felt would soon be captured by the Chinese communists, who had taken over China and established a new government on October 1st, 1949. And he also left out South Korea.
Kim Il-sung, meanwhile, had been pushing Stalin and Mao to support him in a campaign to unite the country by liberating the South by force.
The view in the West at the time and since was that the push for the drive into South Korea from the North came pretty much completely from Moscow, that that's where the decisions were made, and that was where the idea was hatched and then executed by the North Koreans. That's not completely a realistic view. In fact, the drive to reunify Korea came from Pyongyang and from Kim Il-sung, who then had to convince the Soviets and Chinese, who were somewhat reluctant, to go along with his plan.
It's not Stalin who concocts the plan or initiates the Korean War, but Stalin does hold the power of the green light. And I think recent documentary releases from Soviet archives show this. North Korea is not going to attack without Stalin's blessing.
Stalin did agree to supply Kim's army with tanks, planes, artillery, and small arms in quantity, but expressed doubts about invading the U.S.-occupied South.
The whole thing probably could have been avoided if Stalin had done the same thing that Truman had done, which was not arm the peninsula. Instead, the Soviets gave him what he wanted, created a tremendous imbalance in forces, which Kim Il-sung then used to his advantage.
Finally, after the last American combat units were withdrawn from Korea in June of 1949, leaving only a small group of military advisors behind, Stalin was convinced there was little danger of a war with the United States.
Through negotiations with Stalin, he received Stalin's permission and promises of Russian support, as long as Stalin still maintained plausible deniability of involvement in this scheme. And Kim Il-sung also went to China and talked to Mao about his plan. Well, the Chinese were concerned about this, but they thought, okay, this is a Russian and North Korean affair. We are not involved in this, but we will take some precautionary steps. And even before the Korean War broke out, Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist leader, had begun some actions to increase the defense of northeastern China along the border with North Korea.
The stage was set. The Cold War was about to heat up dramatically.